On June 11, 2026, the Russian Ministry of Defense released footage of what it described as a successful electronic warfare operation against an American commercial satellite, providing imagery services to Ukrainian military planners. The footage, subsequently analyzed by multiple open-source intelligence analysts, including those at the Middlebury Institute and the Bellingcat verification team, was assessed as authentic. The satellite in question was a commercial low Earth orbit imaging asset operated by a private American company under a contract with the U.S. government. Its imagery had been providing Ukrainian artillery and drone strike coordinators with near real-time targeting data. And for approximately 4 hours on June 11th, according to Ukrainian military sources who spoke to Reuters, that imagery stream was disrupted. 4 hours, not 4 minutes, 4 hours. Now hold this. The same week, American officials were publicly briefing congressional committees that America's space-based intelligence architecture remains resilient and redundant, and simultaneously a single electronic warfare operation against a commercial satellite disrupted Ukrainian targeting for 4 hours. These two things cannot both be true. And today I'm going to show you what Russia just proved about a gap in America's space architecture that the official framing is obscuring. Right now, CNN is covering Russia's electronic warfare capabilities as a Ukraine story, a tactical development in a tactical theater. Fox News is asking whether this proves Elon Musk's Starlink is more important than the US military's own satellites. The BBC is focused on the diplomatic response from NATO. These framings are all too narrow. They are looking at the symptom. The right question is this: has America's decision to rely on commercial satellite infrastructure for critical military functions created a structural vulnerability that adversaries can exploit without triggering the escalatory thresholds that would apply to an attack on a military satellite? In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how that vulnerability was constructed, why Russia deliberately chose a commercial satellite for this demonstration, what the attack reveals about the gap in America's satellite architecture, and who is watching this demonstration with the most strategic interest. The framework I want to apply is what space strategists call the commercial military seam, the point at which the American military's operational dependence on commercial space infrastructure intersects with the ambiguous legal and escalatory status of attacks on commercial assets. Let me explain this from first principles, because the implications are less obvious than they might appear. When the US military attacks an adversary's military satellite, it is a clear act of war, subject to the laws of armed conflict, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and the escalatory norms that govern state versus state military operations in space. Both sides understand what it means, and both sides have thought through the escalatory ladder that follows. But when Russia attacks an American commercial satellite providing services to the Ukrainian military, is that an attack on America? The satellite is American-owned. The company is American-registered. The contract is with the US government. But the company is a private entity, not a military organization. The satellite was not commissioned as a military system. The legal status of the attack under existing international law is genuinely ambiguous in ways that Russia has deliberately and successfully exploited. This is the commercial military seam, and Russia just demonstrated that they know exactly where it is. The historical anchor here is the Second World War submarine campaign in the Pacific, and specifically the Japanese decision in 1941 to include the commercial merchant marine as a legitimate target for submarine warfare. The American merchant fleet was not a military force in the formal sense, but it was sustaining the Allied war effort with supplies, fuel, and equipment. The Japanese strategic calculation was that targeting the supply infrastructure, even where it was nominally civilian, was legitimate because its military function was undeniable. The Hague Conventions of 1907 had addressed civilian targeting norms. But the line between civilian infrastructure in military use and military infrastructure had never been cleanly resolved. That ambiguity created the legal and normative gap that Japan exploited to devastating effect through submarine warfare against the merchant marine. Russia's electronic warfare operation against an American commercial imaging satellite is structurally identical. A civilian asset in clear military use, targeted under the cover of legal ambiguity about whether attacking it constitutes an act of war against the United States. The ambiguity is the weapon. There are 5 specific dimensions of the satellite gap that Russia's operation revealed, and each one tells you something important about the architecture of American vulnerability in space. Number 1, the American military is now operationally dependent on commercial satellites in ways that were not true a decade ago, and that have developed faster than doctrine or legal frameworks can accommodate. This is documented, not speculative. The 2023 Defense Intelligence Agency report on space threats, which is publicly available in unclassified summary form, explicitly acknowledges the growing military reliance on commercial remote sensing, commercial satellite communications, and commercial space-based positioning augmentation. The Ukraine conflict has accelerated this dependency dramatically. Starlink, a commercial constellation operated by SpaceX, has become a primary tactical communications network for Ukrainian forces, used for everything from drone control to artillery coordination to secure communications between command posts. Planet Labs' commercial imaging satellites have been used to provide near real-time battle damage assessment to Ukrainian planners. The commercial space sector is not supporting the war effort at the margins. It is at the center of the operational architecture and the legal framework governing attacks on commercial space.
Pace out with this operational reality.
Okay, the doctrine is years behind the operational dependency. Number 2, the specific method Russia used in this operation matters as much as the effect, and it has been almost completely lost in the coverage. This was not a kinetic anti-satellite weapon, not a direct descent missile launched to physically destroy the satellite, like the ones China tested in 2007 and Russia tested in 2021. This was an electronic warfare operation, a ground-based or airborne directed energy or radio frequency jamming system targeting the satellite's downlink, the communication channel between the satellite and the receiving ground stations. This distinction is critically important for 2 reasons. First, it means Russia can disrupt American commercial satellite services without creating the debris field that a kinetic asset strike would generate, debris that would threaten Russia's own space assets and would constitute an unmistakable act of military aggression that would trigger clear escalatory responses. Second, it means Russia can target the downlink from within its own territory or from assets in international airspace without the satellite ever being physically threatened. The attack was reversible, deniable at the margins, below the kinetic escalation threshold, and still effective for 4 hours. This is precision legal judo applied to space warfare. Number 3, the redundancy in America's commercial satellite architecture is real, but insufficient for the specific operational scenario Russia just targeted. The American official framing of resilient and redundant implies that disrupting one commercial imaging satellite is inconsequential because others are available to fill the gap. This is partially true in peacetime. It is substantially less true in a contested wartime environment where multiple commercial satellites are being targeted simultaneously through a coordinated electronic warfare campaign. Russia operates ground-based electronic warfare systems, the Krasuka 4 and the Moskva 1 among others. The Moskva Saxon that are crusaders that have documented capabilities against satellite communications. If Russia chose to simultaneously target multiple commercial imaging satellites supporting Ukrainian operations during a critical offensive window, the aggregate disruption could extend well beyond the 4 hours generated by a single operation against a single asset. The redundancy is horizontal, many satellites covering the same geography. The electronic warfare attack is vertical, suppressing the downlink architecture that serves the ground receivers, regardless of which satellite is overhead. The redundancy does not solve the downlink suppression problem. Number 4, the commercial satellite operators occupy a legal and strategic position that gives them no good options when their assets are targeted in a conflict zone. If SpaceX or Planet Labs or Maxar publicly identifies the specific targeting of its assets by Russian electronic warfare, legal and liability question. Is it now a party to the conflict? Does acknowledging military operational dependency create obligations under international humanitarian law? Does it expose the company to Russian countermeasures that might be more severe than the initial disruption? The commercial satellite operators are not equipped, organizationally or legally, to manage the escalatory dynamics of being a participant in a high-intensity military conflict. Their business model, their legal structure, their insurance arrangements, and their regulatory relationships were not designed for this role. The commercial military seam is therefore not just an operational vulnerability. It is an institutional one. The actors in the seam, the commercial satellite companies, one is, do not have the doctrine, the resources, or the legal clarity to respond coherently when an adversary decides to probe the seam. Number 5. The most alarming implication of Russia's satellite operation is not what it did to Ukrainian targeting for 4 hours. It is what it revealed to China about American vulnerability in a Taiwan contingency. The Taiwan operational scenario depends, in ways that are extensively documented in open-source wargaming studies from CSIS, RAND, and the Naval War College, on American and Allied intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance networks providing continuous, near real-time situational awareness of Chinese naval and air movements. A significant portion of this ISR capability, especially at the tactical level, flows through commercial satellite assets. If China has watched Russia's demonstration and observed that a commercial satellite's downlink can be suppressed through electronic warfare without triggering a kinetic American response, China has been given a blueprint for degrading American ISR in a Taiwan scenario at a cost and escalation level that is operationally manageable. The patient giant does not need to develop this capability from scratch. It already has more sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities than Russia's Krasuka-4. Russia just ran the proof of concept test. Now, the strongest counter-argument. The most serious pushback against my analysis is that I am drawing systemic conclusions from a single incident that may have been tactically significant, but strategically limited. American space architecture has genuine redundancy at multiple layers: commercial, military, allied, and the loss of one commercial imaging platform's downlink for 4 hours, while operationally inconvenient, did not materially affect the Ukraine conflict's trajectory in any documented way. Moreover, the American military has been actively developing space resilience measures, including proliferated low Earth orbit constellations, hardened terminals, and alternative downlink pathways, precisely because the commercial satellite dependency vulnerability has been a known concern within the defense community for years. The satellite gap I am describing may be narrower than the single incident suggests, but here is what that argument cannot explain. It cannot explain why the Space Force's budget justification documents, submitted to Congress annually, have consistently identified electronic warfare against commercial satellite downlinks as one of the highest priority threat categories, requiring mitigation, a characterization that would be unnecessary if the redundancy measures already in place were adequate. It cannot explain why commercial satellite operators have been in active discussion with the Pentagon about classified threat briefings and protective measures, discussions that would be superfluous if the resilience architecture were already solved. And it cannot explain why Russia chose this particular operation at this particular moment as a public demonstration rather than a covert degradation. Public demonstrations are signals. Russia wanted this observed and reported. The signal is addressed to multiple audiences, and the audience in Beijing is the most important one. Let me synthesize. The satellite gap Russia just exposed is not the gap between commercial and military satellites. It is the gap between America's operational dependency on commercial space infrastructure and the legal, escalatory, and institutional frameworks governing the protection of that infrastructure. Russia targeted a commercial satellite because doing so is operationally effective and legally ambiguous. The ambiguity is the point. It denies America a clean response. It tests the resolve of commercial operators. It provides China with a validated blueprint, and it does all of this without crossing the kinetic threshold that would invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty or trigger a direct American military response. The gap is not in the satellite architecture. The gap is in the doctrine, the law, and the escalatory norms. And Russia just demonstrated that it knows exactly where that gap is. The hidden beneficiary of Russia's satellite operation is not Ukraine's adversaries in the obvious tactical sense. The hidden beneficiary is the argument within the American government, the argument that has been made for 3 years by space policy advocates who have struggled to generate sufficient urgency in the appropriations process, that the commercial military scene requires doctrine, law, and investment to close it before a peer adversary exploits it in a high-stakes scenario. Russia's operation is the exhibit that makes that argument impossible to dismiss. The patient giant watching from Beijing is not merely noting a vulnerability. It is noting that the vulnerability has been operationally validated, that the American response was measured, and that the legal framework that should deter the next operation is not yet in place. That is a very specific and very useful piece of intelligence for a power planning its own use of space assets in a potential Taiwan contingency. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch whether any American officials publicly characterize Russia's satellite operation as an attack on American commercial property. The language they use matters because it signals where the administration is on the escalatory threshold question. Second, watch whether SpaceX or Planet Labs make any public statements about satellite hardening investments or alternative downlink architecture. Any such statement signals that the commercial operators have received a classified threat assessment that confirmed the vulnerability is real and that protective investment is now justified. Third, watch the Outer Space Treaty and UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space diplomatic channels. If the United States files a formal protest through those channels, it is attempting to establish a legal norm against commercial satellite electronic warfare. The absence of such a protest would be equally informative. It would signal that the US has decided not to legitimize the complaint mechanism, because doing so would constrain its own electronic warfare options against adversary commercial satellites. Your homework is 2 documents. Read the 2023 Defense Intelligence Agency Challenges to Security in Space report, which is publicly available on the DIA website and which describes the electronic warfare threat to commercial satellites in unclassified detail. Then read the Secure World Foundation's annual Global Counterspace Capabilities Report, which tracks the development of anti-satellite capabilities across all major space powers. Put those 2 documents next to the footage Russia released this week and tell me the redundancy argument holds. If you can show me that the mitigation measures currently in place are adequate for the threat environment described in those documents, prove it in the comments. I want that challenge. Here is the question I leave you with. When a military power becomes operationally dependent on commercial infrastructure that was not designed for military use, does not have military-grade protection, and does not operate under military rules of engagement, who is responsible for its defense when an adversary decides to exploit it? The military that depends on it, the company that operates it, the government that contracted it, and if nobody has a clear, legally grounded, operationally tested answer to that question before the next conflict that depends on it begins, what happens to the 4 hours of targeting darkness while the lawyers are still arguing? I will see you in the next one. Let me give you the additional strategic depth that completes this picture. The satellite gap Russia exposed this week sits at the intersection of 3 separate vulnerabilities that individually would each be manageable, but that together create a structural fragility in American military architecture that is more serious than any single element suggests. The first vulnerability is the operational one I have described: dependency on commercial satellites in military functions. The second is the legal one: the ambiguous status of commercial satellites in armed conflict under existing international law. The third is the industrial one: the concentration of critical satellite manufacturing capability in a small number of American commercial firms whose supply chains include components from countries including Taiwan and South Korea, that could themselves be compromised or disrupted in a major power conflict. If a Taiwan conflict disrupts the semiconductor supply chains that feed the commercial satellite manufacturing industry, America's ability to replace degraded satellite capacity would be compromised in the very moment when that capacity was most urgently needed. This is the triple convergence problem. Operational dependency, legal vulnerability, and industrial fragility all intersecting at the same point of failure, at the same moment of maximum strategic pressure. Russia's electronic warfare demonstration exposed the operational layer. The legal layer remains unresolved. The industrial layer has not even been publicly discussed in the terms it deserves. And there is one more dimension that I want to address directly, because it connects to the cost ratio argument that runs through all of my analysis of American strategic vulnerabilities. The electronic warfare system Russia used to disrupt the commercial satellite downlink, whether the Krasukha 4 or a more advanced successor, has an estimated procurement cost in the range of $50 to $100 million per system. The commercial imaging satellite it disrupted has an estimated replacement cost of approximately $200 to $400 million per unit, not counting the launch costs, and the operational intelligence value of 4 uninterrupted hours of near real-time tactical imagery over an active battlefield, in terms of targeting decisions enabled and outcomes influenced, is incalculable but unambiguously significant. Russia achieved 4 hours of ISR denial at a cost ratio that once again runs the wrong way for the defender. This is the cost ratio trap manifested in space. Expensive capability, cheap suppression. The satellite architecture has the same structural vulnerability as the Patriot architecture, the carrier architecture, and every other American precision capability in the current strategic environment. It is exquisitely capable and disproportionately expensive to defend relative to the cost of disrupting it. Russia just confirmed that the cost ratio logic extends above the atmosphere as surely as it operates on the ground and at sea. That is the full strategic significance of 4 hours of satellite darkness over Ukraine. The final layer I want to add to this analysis is about the signaling architecture of what Russia just did and why the specific choice to make it public was as important as the technical operation itself. Russia has conducted electronic warfare operations against satellite systems before. Less publicized instances have been reported by the Middlebury Institute and others going back to at least 2019. What is different about this week's operation is the deliberate public release of footage, the specific timing relative to ongoing congressional debates about U.S. Space Force budget allocation, and the choice of a commercially contracted American asset as the target rather than a Ukrainian military system. Each of these choices was deliberate. The public release signals to adversaries, specifically Beijing, that the capability is mature enough to be displayed without compromising its future effectiveness. The timing relative to congressional debate suggests an awareness of American domestic political dynamics that is itself a form of cognitive warfare, introducing uncertainty about American space resilience at exactly the moment when that uncertainty has the most disruptive effect on the budget conversation. And the choice of a commercial American asset rather than a Ukrainian military one tests a specific hypothesis, whether the United States will treat an attack on a commercial American asset as an attack on American interests, requiring a direct response. The answer, so far as no, not a direct response. Russia has recorded that answer, and so has Beijing. And this brings me to the observation that I think matters most in terms of the long-term trajectory of this vulnerability. America's satellite dependency is not going to decrease. The military's operational reliance on commercial space infrastructure is going to increase as commercial capabilities become more sophisticated, more affordable, and more deeply integrated into military operational planning. The commercial military seam is not a temporary condition created by a specific program decision that can be reversed. It is a structural feature of the emerging space economy, in which commercial space capabilities are developing faster than military space programs can match, and in which the military's rational response used the commercial capabilities that are available now, which creates dependency that adversaries will exploit. This means the satellite gap Russia just exposed is not a problem that will solve itself as military space architecture matures. It is a problem that will grow as commercial space integration deepens. Russia knows this. China knows this. The question is whether the American strategic community generates the doctrinal and legal architecture to manage this reality before the next demonstration is not 4 hours of Ukrainian ISR disruption, but something with far more immediate and irreversible consequences.